Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burckhardt. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. Today is September 20th, 2023, and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. I do not have quite as much energy as I usually do for these because I woke up today with a raging headache, but I am going to soldier on because today is a special day. I'm actually recording this on the 19th, which happens to be my birthday. And for my birthday, I'm giving myself a present that I get to take over my own podcast and talk about my books for once. I try not to do it too much whenever I'm interviewing somebody else other than to be able to contribute to the conversation, to show that I do understand what they're going through because I've done the same things that they're doing. But I try not to spend time talking about my books because the interviews are about my guest author's books. So a lot of times, even though I may talk about it with the author that's in the interview, I usually cut that part all out in editing. But today, it's all going to make it in the show, and I'm going to tell you about the Into the West Saga serial that I write as Dianne Burckhardt. I also have 2 upcoming book projects that are going to be published under Dianne Burckhardt. And then, of course, we have all of the Burckhardt Books projects with the podcast and the magazine. So stick around. This probably won't be as long as it usually is whenever I have a guest because I will just end up rambling and repeating myself at some point. So we'll try and cut it off before then. But now the first thing I want to talk to you about is the book series that I write as Dianne Burckhardt. That's StephenBurckhardt. This is a pen name that I decided to use whenever I wrote my very first book that I put out. And I used a pen name because I was really afraid that I was not going to be good at this anymore. Because after having all of the brain surgeries, and in case you're new to my podcast, I have 3 neurological conditions for which I have had 6 brain surgeries in 2004. I had a lot of brain damage. I lost a lot of my language skills. And whenever we moved to Europe, I did not know the languages well enough here to get a job in the local industries. So I was trying to think of what I could do to make some money. And I wanted to go back to writing. I have a degree in journalism. I also have a degree in forensic criminology. But I had been a writer. And I thought maybe I can go back and do something like that. I found a freelance site and actually had a couple of offers to ghostwrite books for other people. And this is a great test for me to see if I can do it because I have that gatekeeper before publication. Because the person who's hiring me to write this book for them, if I'm really horrible, they're not going to buy it. They're not going to pay me for it. They're not going to publish it. So I figured I was safe writing these books and trying to see how I did. Both of the books sold, both of the books were published, and both of them did very well. So I thought, okay, if I can do this for them, I'm going to try doing it for me. And I decided to sit down and write the first book in this Saga serial that I have. But I was still a little hesitant because, I had that gatekeeper before with the customer buying the book for me to publish. I didn't have that anymore. So I was really worried since I'm going to be the one taking my book and self-publishing it. There's no gatekeeper to tell me whether or not it's worth publishing. So I thought I really don't want people to know that this is me, just in case I'm really bad at it. So I hid behind a pen name, Dianne Burckhardt, and I went ahead and published anyway. And then I decided to enter it into a contest for historical fiction because I thought this contest will be a really good indicator if I'm doing this well. There's no way it's going to win if it's really, really bad. And I'll also get some critiques back from the judges, and it will let me know what I need to work on. So the first book, Into the West, The Orphan Train, won 2 medals. It won a finalist medal in historical fiction in 2019. And then it was also a judge's nominee for the next year in 2020. So obviously, I'm not horrible at this. And those awards really gave me the incentive and the confidence to keep going with this serial. And now the serial is complete with the 7th novella that just came out on the 19th, Into the West Family Ties. I have actually completed the entire story. The entire saga is in print and available to buy right now. And so far, the reviews have been really good. So, all things considered, I'm pretty happy with how this series went out. Now, just a few years ago, I decided to start telling people that I was actually Stephen. And I've been coming out a little bit more to try and advertise the books, because before I couldn't really advertise them, because whenever people would ask me to do interviews, when they wanted Dianne Burckhardt to go do interviews for podcasts and things like that, I couldn't do it. If I did an interview, somebody might notice that I do not look like the man who's on my website, which is, by the way, my father when he was my age when I wrote the book. But now I want to tell you a little bit about the Into the West Saga serial. This story is actually based on a few stories that a friend of mine told me, and I can never remember if it's her mother or her grandmother, but one of the women came to Kansas on the orphan train. And she told us a few stories about what happened after she was adopted off the train. She was not particularly treated well. She was more an indentured servant to the family. And when her adoptive parents died, she didn't inherit anything from them. They left everything to their biological son and left her nothing. Now, not all orphan train writers had that experience. And one of the things that I did to learn more about this before I wrote the books was I went to the Orphan Train Museum in Concordia, Kansas. And if you ever have the opportunity to do that, I highly recommend it, because you will learn so much about what happened during this point in history when they were using orphan trains to bring children from the East Coast into the Western territories to try and find them homes. Another big influence for this saga was my father's own history. He and his sisters were taken from his parents when they were very young and put into a children's home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My dad told me a lot of stories about the time that he and his sister spent there in the children's home. And actually, one of the scenes that my main character, Elizabeth McBride, goes through is actually taken directly from something that happened to my father while he was in the children's home. And if you read the book, when Elizabeth is out of her room past bedtime, she gets in trouble and she's punished. And that punishment scene is the one that my father described to me. So you can see that these stories are very personal for me. And another thing that makes them very personal is if you look at the front of the book, there's an acknowledgement section that has a list of people's names. And one of the things with my neurological conditions is I have a really hard time now remembering names. I can remember names from people that I knew before the surgeries, but people that I've met since, unless I see them quite often, I cannot remember their names. And it was also a big problem writing these books that whenever I was creating characters, I couldn't remember the names of the characters that I had created. And I started to think, okay, I can remember these people that I went to high school with. Maybe if I use their names, I'll be able to remember the characters. And I contacted some of my friends and I asked them, can I use your name for my story? And they all agreed. I was so shocked and thankful. But it worked. Whenever I named a character after one of my friends, I could remember the name suddenly. So it was very helpful. These books not only include my family history, but history of my friends' families and the names of so many of my friends. So this series is very personal, and I think the story is worth telling. And I think the story of the orphan train writers themselves is very important to tell, whether it's nonfiction or fictionalized history, as long as you're accurate about it, this is a point in history that needs to be remembered and passed on for the fact that it was a very unique historical moment for the United States. This is not something that happened in too many other countries, if any at all, about putting children on trains and taking them out somewhere else to find them homes. This is unique to the American experience and something in history that is worth remembering. So the story actually follows Elizabeth and Connor McBride. Their parents had immigrated from Ireland, and unfortunately, 1 month after Connor was born, their father died of influenza. Now, Connor is named for his father, and his older sister, Elizabeth, they are very close. They have never been apart, and their mother is trying very hard to work and keep them in a home and take care of them, but it just gets to be too much for her, and she cannot support them anymore. She starts watching her children go to bed hungry and getting thinner, and even though they're still very happy, she could see that they were not going to stay healthy for long if she didn't find someone else who could help care for them. So she turns them over to the Catholic Foundling Aid Society that is affiliated with her church. They accept her children from her and they put them in their foundling home. Now, Margaret, when she gave her children to the church, she assumed that they would find a family to care for them and adopt them locally in New York. And maybe she could watch them grow up from afar, even if she couldn't be with them every day. But what ended up happening is the children are put on the orphan train and sent out into the Wild West. This series is set in 1859 before the Civil War, and the first few books follow Elizabeth and Connor as they stop at different towns along the orphan train route, meeting families and the experiences they have with the other children on the trains. Eventually, Elizabeth and Connor are adopted, but into separate families. Luckily, the families are close, so they do get to see each other, but they're no longer living together as brother and sister. The next few books in the serial describe Elizabeth and Connor's life as they start to build new families in the Wild West. And of course, as often happens, just as they start to find their footing in their new lives, people from the past come back and shake up everything in their world. And the final book that just dropped on September 19th, Into the West Family Ties, wraps up the entire saga and brings a satisfying close to all of the storylines. Something I should probably mention about this entire Into the West saga serial is each book builds on the book before it. It is one complete story that is separated into installments, and each book is its own installment in the saga serial. Because of this, the numbering of chapters continues from the first book through the last book. Whenever you get the next book in the serial, it does not start again at chapter 1. It starts at the chapter of the book before it ended on. So I'm going to read to you now from Into the West Family Ties, and we begin with the first chapter in this installment, which is chapter 55 in the saga. This book is published on Amazon.com under the name Dianne Burckhardt. Chapter 55, Into the West Family Ties. Martin Stewart II had always lived a blessed life. He was the firstborn son of Thomas and Eloise Stewart, but he had two older sisters, Eleanor and Eileen. Unfortunately, Eileen did not survive her first year. Martin was followed by Thomas Jr., Franklin, and Emily. Thomas named Martin after his own father, Martin Oliver Stewart. The elder Martin Stewart had been a hero to Thomas. He was the one who took the chance and moved his family to the New World and put them all on the path which had allowed Thomas and his brothers to make such wonderful lives for their families. It seemed the least Thomas could do was to name his firstborn son after him for all he had done for them. Martin had grown up being attended to by the best nannies and tutors available before attending a preparatory school in New York City. Even with all their hired help, Thomas always made time to help his children with their care and studies when he was home in the evenings. He also made sure they all had at least one outing together on the weekends. Family was everything to Thomas Stewart. There was nothing he wouldn't do to ensure his family's success and happiness. Martin remembered watching his father on the family outings. Even though his father had become what was considered a lumber baron and held a position of great respect in the business and social communities of New York City, he never put on airs. There were many people who had come to the Americas who had not been as lucky as the Stewarts, and Thomas never let his children think their good fortune made them better than those who had less. Thomas would often stop and talk to destitute individuals on the street who were asking for charity. He always asked their names and where they were from originally. He would ask if they were looking for work or just needed a little extra to get by. More than once, Thomas offered a job to someone he met on their outings and always gave them a donation and asked for nothing in return, other than to be able to shake their hand and wish them well. It was this sense of community that had always impressed Martin most about his father, and undoubtedly had a big influence on his own actions when it came to Mrs. Margaret McBride. Martin remembered the first time he saw Margaret. She had been hired while he was off visiting his grandparents in upstate New York. He had sent word home to let them know when he would be returning. When his carriage pulled up to the house, he was surprised and delighted to see the whole household outside waiting to greet him. As he went around to everyone thanking them for the warm welcome, he surprised them all with small gifts he had brought for everyone. While at his grandparents' home, Martin's grandmother taught him how to make fudge. In all honesty, he mostly stirred things for his granny while she made the fudge, but she insisted it counted as helping her to make it. Martin and his granny then wrapped up large blocks of fudge in butcher's paper and tied them with string. He had one for everyone and had kept one for himself. Everyone was delighted with the treats. When Mrs. Hanover introduced Martin to Margaret McBride, he was immediately taken with her. She had a wild mess of curly red hair that she was barely able to contain in a bun at the nape of her neck, which was long and slender and the color of fine porcelain. Several rebellious curls had escaped her bun and made a soft frame around her beautiful face. Martin was particularly enamored with the freckles that lightly covered her face, running from one high cheekbone over the bridge of her delicate nose to end on her other cheek. She was stunning. The sight of her nearly left him speechless. "Mr. Stewart, sir," said Mrs. Hanover, "I'd like to present Mrs. McBride. She's our new scullery maid." Mrs. Hanover turned to Margaret. "Mrs. McBride, I'd like to introduce you to Martin Stewart the second, Mr. Stewart's eldest son and heir." Martin was surprisingly disappointed to hear Margaret's married title, but he hoped he hit it well. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. McBride," said Martin. "Has your husband come to work with us as well?" "No, sir," said Margaret as she lowered her gaze to the floor. "I am a widow, sir. 'Tis only my children and me." "Oh, please forgive my blunder, madam. I hope I did not cause you any distress." Margaret looked up at Martin for a moment. She looked to be sizing him up. At least, that's how her intense gaze made him feel. He liked that she was so bold. Many women in her position were so humbled by their station in life, they rarely met a man's gaze so directly. Martin liked her gumption. "There's no need for forgiveness, sir. No offense was made. My husband, Connor, has been gone these past 2 years. There's no way you could have known." For a moment, the two stood looking at each other. It was a strange yet comfortable silence. Mrs. Hanover, however, did not find it as comfortable and cleared her throat to break it. "Right," said Martin absent-mindedly. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. McBride, but I do not have a gift for you. Had I known we had a new maid, I would have brought you a gift as well." "'Tis quite all right, Mr. Stewart," said Margaret. "I would not expect a gift. I have only just begun here. I have not yet earned such a kindness." Martin gave Margaret a playful scowl. "Nonsense, madam. You have agreed to put up with this mad lot of Stewarts. There's no amount of compensation that will ever be enough for that." Martin laughed as he put his hands in his pockets and realized he had his own piece of fudge still in his jacket pocket. "Wait, here we go," said Martin as he pulled the small package out of his pocket and held it up. "I completely forgot I had kept one back for myself." Martin held the bundle out toward Margaret. "I cannot take something you would save for yourself, sir. That is much too generous," said Margaret as she held her hands up, refusing to take the bundle. Martin just smiled at her as he reached out and took one of her hands in his and turned it over with the palm up. She had the rough hands of a woman who worked hard every day, and yet there was something about that which appealed to him. Martin resisted, running his thumb over the palm of her hand as he placed the bundle in it and curled her fingers over the top. He placed his now empty hand over hers and gently pulled her in a little closer as he leaned down toward her. "I insist you take this one, if not for yourself, for your children. I am sure they will love it." Margaret looked down at her hand where it was gently trapped between Martin's large, warm hands. For a moment, she could think of nothing else but how nice it felt to have such a good man show her such kindness. When Mrs. Hanover cleared her throat again, Margaret looked up at Martin and smiled and laughed a little. "I think you have a bit of the Irish in you, sir. You have the gift of the blarney." Martin laughed. "That has to be the nicest way anyone has ever called me relentless and insistent," said Martin. He laughed again and then added, "I take that to mean you accept." Margaret smiled and even blushed a little. "Aye, sir," said Margaret as she smiled shyly, looking at the ground. She pushed a strand of hair behind her ear as she looked back up at Martin. "For my children, I will accept this thoughtful gift. They will be ever so grateful, as am I. Thank you, sir." Martin's smile grew wider as he watched the blush spread down her neck. Mrs. Hanover cleared her throat a third time. This time it was loud enough that it made Martin glance in her direction. When she had his eyes, she pointedly glanced down to where Martin still held Margaret's hand in his own. "Oh," said Martin, as it registered to him that he was still holding her hand. He patted her hand and let it go. "Goodness, please forgive me, Mrs. McBride. I must be overtired from traveling. I was completely unaware I still held your hand." Mrs. Hanover did her best to hide a smirk as she commented, "Perhaps we should get you inside, sir, so you can rest and gather your wits about you." Martin had known Mrs. Hanover his whole life, and the two had often given each other guff over the years. Martin smiled as he gave the older woman a sideways glance. "Yes, perhaps we should, Mrs. Hanover." Martin stifled a chuckle at the woman's teasing, then looked back over at Margaret. "It was wonderful to meet you, madam. I hope you enjoy being part of this madhouse." Margaret smiled and curtsied as she spoke. "Thank you kindly, Mr. Stewart. I'm quite sure I will." Mrs. Hanover and Martin took their leave and left Margaret to go back to her work in the house. When the pair were out of range of Margaret's hearing, Mrs. Hanover started to tisk at Martin. Martin laughed as he stopped and turned toward the woman who was essentially a second mother to him. "Is there something you wish to say, Mrs. Hanover?" Martin stood grinning at the woman as she faced him and shook her head. "I think you already well know what I would say, Mr. Stewart." Martin dropped his gaze as he felt himself blush a little. He laughed as he looked up at the woman again. "You know, I did not mean anything inappropriate by my actions. I got lost in her for a moment." Mrs. Hanover had to laugh at the sheepish look Martin was giving her. "I know you're a good man with good intentions, Mr. Stewart, but many a good man has made bad decisions when in the presence of a beautiful woman." And I think we're going to go ahead and stop there. That was Into the West Family Ties, the 7th and final book in the Into the West Saga serial, which is published under the name Stephen Burckhardt, but I, Dianne Burckhardt, am actually the author behind that pen name. It is available now on Amazon.com. You can find links on our website at burkhartbooks.com/books. This title actually dropped yesterday on my birthday as a little gift to myself. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to very quickly go through the next few books that I have that I'm working on that will be published under Dianne Burckhardt. I have 2 books that I'm working on simultaneously. One is a fiction and one is a nonfiction. The fiction book is an FBI profiler thriller called The Touch. I have a degree in forensic criminology and I actually specialized in criminal profiling. And I really wanted to do something with all of that information and education that I had. And since I no longer qualify to work on a crime scene unit, I figured I can use this to write some very compelling thrillers. So The Touch will hopefully be coming out sometime next year if it actually works out, me writing 2 books in tandem, because the other book, the nonfiction, which is Free Bad Haircuts with Each Craniotomy, which you can probably guess is all about my medical history, where I found out that I had neurological conditions that required brain surgery, and the 7 surgeries that I had in 6 months in 2004, 6 of those being brain surgeries. And then, of course, my recovery afterwards that led me to the point where I am today, self-publishing books, doing a podcast, and starting an online magazine. So this book hopefully will come out next year in October, and I really want to publish it then because that will actually be the 20th anniversary of the last brain surgery that I had. That time in the hospital, that last experience, was when I died, came back, got better, had my last brain surgery, and finally went on the road to recovery, which took, I would say, at least a good 10, 12 years to really get back to where I felt functional again. So it's a very interesting story, all the things that happened to bring me to the point where I am today. So those are the 2 books that I'm working on, the fiction book, The Touch, the FBI profiler thriller, and Free Bad Haircuts with Each Craniotomy, which tells all about my neurological experiences and all the brain surgeries. Now, hopefully those will both come out in 2024. We will see. If nothing else, I do plan on publishing Free Bad Haircuts with Each Craniotomy next year in celebration of the 20th anniversary of all of that. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully this writing in tandem will work out very well. I've never tried to do this before, but I think with one being fiction and one being nonfiction, they just might balance each other out enough that I can do this. We'll see. It'll be a fun experiment. Now, for Burckhardt Books, of course, we've got the podcast going, and there has been some amazing developments for the podcast. You would not believe this, but we are getting such an influx of fantastic author guests wanting to be on this show to talk to all of you, and I am loving every minute of this. I have got some great guests lined up, and I only have 4 spots left to fill out the rest of this year, and then we won't be booking anybody until next February. I can't believe how fast all of these interviews have filled up this year. It's been amazing, and I have a feeling it's only going to keep getting better. And what's great about me having to stay so busy with all of these authors, it means that all of you are going to be introduced to some fantastic people in the future who are probably going to end up giving you some of your favorite books. Now, of course, don't forget, we have the companion to our podcast, Book Banter Magazine, is coming. And it is turning out so nice. I'm having so much fun putting this thing together. It's taking me right back to my college days when I was working for magazines and newspapers and doing all that layout. It's a lot of fun. And we're going to have live links so that you can find the episode that the author was on with Book Banter with Dianne Burckhardt, the podcast. That will be in the magazine, so you can just click and go to their episode so that you can hear more of their interview. It's going to have live links to their bio pages for their books, and some of the authors are letting me put in their trailers too, so you can see trailers for their series and individual books. It is going to be so much fun for me to bring this to you. I hope you all enjoy the magazine as much as I am enjoying doing it. Now, I was planning to do readings from Free Bad Haircuts with Each Craniotomy and The Touch today as well. But honestly, because of the storm front that came through, I have got such a raging headache, and I just don't think I could last to do that. I am so sorry. So we're going to go ahead and end it here. I just wanted to give you an update on all of the things that are coming up with Stephen Burckhardt, Dianne Burckhardt, and Burckhardt Books with Book Banter, the podcast, and Book Banter Magazine. So many things are going on right now. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast to hear future updates on what's coming up for all of these areas of Burckhardt Books. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter so that you can be one of the first to find out what's going on, because new things are always happening. And you know, if you love books like we do, you do not want to miss this podcast or a single issue of Book Banter Magazine. So now you know what time it is, folks. It is time for you to all to go forth and be very happy.